माधव कुंज बिहारी। हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Radha Gopinath, Radha Gopinath, Shri Radhe. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramhams Parivarikacharya Shatarishta Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Abhay Charnaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramhamsa Parivrajacharya Shatarishta Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Samaveta Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Jainitai Gaur Premanande. Srimati Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Okay, today we're reading from Canto 3, Chapter 5, Vidura's Talks with Maitreya, text 42. Yach shraddhaya shrutavatya cha bhaktya. Yach shraddhaya shrutavatya cha bhaktya. Samrijyamane hridaye vadaya. Samrijyamane hridaye vadaya. Jnanena vairagya balena dhira. Jnanena vairagya balena dhira. Vrajema tattengri saroja pitam. Vrajema tattengri saroja pitam. Yachchaddaya shrutavatya cha bhaktya. Samrijyamane hridaye vadaya. Jnanena vairagya balena dhira. Vrajema tattengri saroja pitam.
Samrijyamane hridaye vadaya. Jnanena vairagya balena dhira. Vrajema tattengri saroja pitam. Yashadhaya shuddhavatya cha bhaktya. Samrijyamane hridaye vadaya. Jnanena vairagya balena dhira. Vrajema tattengri saroja pitam.
Word for word, yat, that which, shraddhaya, by eagerness, shrutavatya, simply by hearing, cha, also, bhaktya, in devotion, samrijyamane, being cleansed, hridaye, in the heart, avadhaya, meditation, jnanena, by knowledge, vairagya, detachment, balena, by the strength of, dhiraha, the pacified, vrajema, must go to, tat, that, te, your, angry feet, saroja pitam, lotus sanctuary. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Translation: simply by hearing about your lotus feet with eagerness and devotion, and by meditating upon them within the heart, one at once becomes enlightened with knowledge, and on the strength of detachment, one becomes pacified. We must therefore take shelter of the sanctuary of your lotus feet. Purport: the miracles of meditating on the lotus feet of the Lord with eagerness and devotion are so great that no other process can compare to it. The minds of materialistic persons are so disturbed that it is almost impossible for them to search after the supreme truth by personal regulative endeavors. But even such materialistic men with a little eagerness for hearing about the transcendental name, fame, qualities, etc., can surpass all other methods of attaining knowledge and detachment. The conditioned soul is attached to the bodily conception of the self, and therefore he is in ignorance. Culture of self-knowledge can bring about detachment from material affection, and without detachment there is no meaning to knowledge. The most stubborn attachment for material enjoyment is sex life. One who is attached to sex life is to be understood as devoid of knowledge. Knowledge must be followed by detachment. That is the way of self-realization. These two essentials for self-realization, knowledge and detachment, become manifest very quickly if one performs devotional service to the lotus feet of the Lord. The word dhira is very significant in this connection. A person who is not disturbed even in the presence of cause of disturbance is called a dhira. Sri Yamunacharya says, "Since my heart has been overwhelmed by the devotional service of Lord Krishna, I cannot even think of sex life. And if thoughts of sex come upon me, I at once feel disgust." A devotee of the Lord becomes an elevated dhira simply by the simple process of meditating in eagerness on the lotus feet of the Lord. Devotional service entails being initiated by a bona fide spiritual master and following his instruction in regard to hearing about the Lord. Such a bona fide spiritual master is accepted by regularly hearing from him about the Lord. The improvement in knowledge and detachment can be perceived by devotees as an actual experience. Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu strongly recommended this process of hearing from a bona fide devotee, and by following this process one can achieve the highest result, conquering all other methods. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Gadahmayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamsha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamashwari Vansha Kalpatarubhyasya Kripa Sindhu Bhevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasari Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare. Okay, so we're continuing on the prayers which are being offered by the demigods for them to activate themselves into their duty. Just how Lord Brahma was clueless about what to do when he took birth. Padmaja, his name is, lotus born from the lotus navel of Garbhodakashayi Vishnu, and he engaged in tapasya to get the audience of Krishna and get enlightened about how to start creating the universe. So in the same way, the demigods, after the creation of the Mahatattva, are now praying to Mahavishnu so that they can be instructed and edified on how to actually go about governing the material universe. And a couple of verses ago, so 2 days ago, I think Kamsari Prabhu was giving the class. So there, Srila Prabhupada in the purport was focusing on how the living being is harassed by the three modes of material nature. Right? Adi Bhautik, the three kleshas, rather, the three kleshas, Adi Bhautik, Adi Devik, and Adi Atmik. And in yesterday's verse, and in today's verse, the answer is given, that one has to take shelter of the lotus feet of the Lord, which are the places of pilgrimage. And today's verse, the demigods is saying, simply by hearing about your lotus feet with eagerness and meditating upon them within the heart, one becomes enlightened with knowledge. So in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, there's a method to combat the mind. I mean, you probably heard of this method, but it's officially coming from Patanjali Rishi. So if some negative thought comes in your mind, then instantly you counter that negative thought or that vasana with a thought of positivity. Right? So I remember when I was a new bhakta, that time Ganesham Prabhu was talking to me, we were having a meeting, and he told me that if any distracting thoughts come into your mind, then immediately, first of all, take good darshan of Gopinath, Radha Gopinath. So don't forget that darshan that you take, that's very important. So the darshan is not just for the time that you're taking it, but you're supposed to carry that darshan throughout the entire day, at least. And then whenever these thoughts bombard your mind, then immediately think of the form of Gopinath. You can think of his beautiful face, you can think of his lotus feet. So the demigods are saying this. So to think of his lotus feet, then one can stop being harassed and ambushed by the material nature. Devi yeshu gunamayi mama maya duratiya mame vaye prapatente maya metam tarantite. So this verse is exemplifying that statement by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Two other verses come to mind when we read this purport here. The first one is Savai Krishna, Savai pumsam paro dharmo yato bhakti radokshuje janayati ashu vairagyam jnanam chayad ahitukam. So Srila Prabhupada is focusing on the result of meditating on Krishna. The result of engaging in the devotional services Krishna is that one develops transcendental knowledge. And Prabhupada is saying, at least twice in the purport, Srila Prabhupada is saying that the result of transcendental knowledge then is supposed to be renunciation and detachment. And the other verse, similarly, which comes to mind is Bhakti Pareshanu Bhava Viraktir Anyatra Chaisha Trika Eka Kala. And then the last line goes Tushti Pushti Shud Abhaya Anughasam. So when one eats, one gets tushti, one gets satisfaction, pushti gets strength, and on the negative benefit is that one's hunger goes away, kshudapaya. So in the same way, when one practices bhakti, then, or devotional service, one gets love for Krishna, bhakti itself. One gets pareshanu bhava. That means direct perception of Krishna. So Krishna, pleased with the devotee's devotion, reveals himself directly to the devotee from within the heart. And the negative benefit is one gets virakti. So again, that's the theme of today's purport, renunciation and transcendental knowledge. The Shastras explain that there's a third result after virakti, and we'll come to that a bit later. But just one thing that comes to my mind is that generally speaking, when we see in the Shastra, when people cultivate devotional service and when people get transcendental knowledge about Krishna, then once they meet Krishna or once they come in touch with Krishna, then generally either they go back home, back to Godhead, or they engage in Krishna's pure devotional service. Whereas those who come in contact with Krishna without knowledge of Krishna or without cultivating devotion towards Krishna, we often see in the Shastra that their destination is that they prefer to go back to the heavenly planets and keep enjoying their life. For example, we see in the Krishna book the example of the crocodile that eats Nanda Maharaj, or the snake that eats Nanda Maharaj when they go to for the yatra, Shiva Ratri. Yeah. So there's a snake which comes, and the snake starts to eat on the margin, and Krishna comes along, little boy Krishna, he comes along and he touches the snake, right, with his foot, and then the snake turns into a Gandharva. Right? And then all he does is he just circumambulates Krishna, and then he says, okay, so can I go back to my heavenly planets and continue my life there? Krishna says, okay, you can go. Similarly, there's the example of the Manigriva, Nala Kuvera, as well, the sons of Kuvera. We see that Narada Muni curses them. They stand as trees, and then they offer their prayers to Krishna, and they go back to the heavenly planets. Or we see the example in Ramayana. I recently read the example of a demon called Kabanda. And he was cursed and by some rishi. And then, Indra. In some battle by Indra, what happened is that Indra pulverized him so much that he pushed his hands and his head into his body in some battle. So it was a demon, he pushed his hands and his head into his body. And then this demon started to plead to Indra, Indra, please kill me. I don't want to live like this. It's too torturous to live like this. So then Indra says, the only time you'll be relieved of your curse is when Rama comes, and then he gives you his blessings, and then you'll be relieved of that curse. So we see that when Lord Ram and Lakshman, they're searching for Sita. This is before they come to Kishkinda. This is before they meet Sugriva, just before they meet Sugriva, because one of the things that Kabanda, I think that's the name, Kabanda, one of the things that Kabanda does is that he leads Rama and Lakshman to a powerful ally which will help them in their search for Sita, and that ally is Sugriva and the rest of the monkeys like Hanuman and Angad and all these. So Kabanda, he's there, and he's like sort of like a tree stump. He's just this huge demon just standing there. He doesn't have a head. And he just has these long... maybe he pushed his feet into his body. I can't remember. But anyway, his head was in his body, and either his hands or his legs were in his body. But he was just standing there, and he had these massive, long, tentacle-like arms. And he would just throw them out into the forest and get his prey. That's how he would survive. So anyway, he captures Lakshman and Ram like that, and there's a big battle, and they cut off his arms and all that sort of stuff. And then finally, he's like, oh, who is this? Who are you? And Ram says that I'm Rama. And then he gets really ecstatic. Oh, I was told by Indra that once you would come, I'd be relieved of this curse. So we see that what happens in Ramayana is that as soon as that happens, he gets transformed into his original sort of heavenly sort of body, and then he ascends to the sky. And before he does that, he leads Ram and Lakshman onto Sugriva in Kishkinda. So we see instances like that, where people don't cultivate devotion, and because of a lack of transcendental knowledge, because they didn't cultivate devotion, even though they're in contact with Krishna, they don't get the full benefit of devotional service, which is to render more devotional service selflessly, and or to go back to the spiritual world. There's an exception to that rule. For example, Bhishma Dev, when he's passing away on the bed of arrows, he explains, I think it's in his prayers, he explains that just see how merciful Krishna is, that all these soldiers which are arrayed on the battlefield, they may have known who Krishna is, or they may have not known who Krishna is. And in most instances, most of them didn't know who Krishna is. Didn't know Krishna's actual identity, right? Most people thought he was just a powerful person, or the closest they would come is that he must be the Paramatma. But no one had knowledge that he was actually the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So they were killed by Krishna on the battlefield. And it's explained in the Shastra that even though they lacked knowledge of who Krishna is, Krishna's mercy is so great that they still attained their original spiritual swarup, and they went back home, back to Godhead. All the soldiers who were killed on the battlefield. So there's an exception to the rule, because Krishna is Swarat, he is independent. But generally speaking, we see that those who cultivate knowledge of Krishna, then they make the full benefit of their contact with Krishna. Whereas those who don't know anything about Krishna, then even though they come in touch with Krishna, they continue their life how it was before. So I thought of approaching this purport today, this verse today, on the themes of knowledge and its result, which is renunciation. So in terms of knowledge, I was recently reading a purport in the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, where it's talking about the 6 schools of philosophy in the Vedic culture. Right? The way I like to remember these 6 schools of philosophy is to go from the very gross philosophy, the very materialistic philosophy, to the more subtle and refined philosophy. So the most gross philosophy is the Karma Mimamsa, or otherwise known as the Purva Mimamsa philosophy. And then after that we have the Vaisheshika philosophy, which is the atomic philosophy. And then after that, the next, you could say more subtle, is the Sankhya philosophy. And then we have the Nyaya philosophy. So now we're getting off the material platform. We're starting to think on the level of the mind. That's what that philosophy is about. It's about logics and inference. And then after Nyaya, we have the Yoga philosophy. And then finally, we have the Vedanta philosophy. And Vyasadeva, he had many disciples, and these disciples of Vyasadeva, they took charge of these different branches of knowledge. It's explained in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So the Acharya of the Karma Mimamsa philosophy is Jaimini Rishi. There's an interesting story that Kamsari Prabhu told me about Jaimini Rishi. If I have time, I'll say that story. So Jaimini Rishi is the Acharya of Karma Mimamsa. And then you have Vaisheshika. So there's a Rishi called Kanada Rishi. He's the Acharya of Vaisheshika philosophy. And then Sankhya. You know who's Sankhya? Kapila. But Srila Prabhupada makes it a point many times to note the difference that actually Lord Kapila, the incarnation of Krishna, he's the original sort of founder or Acharya of the actual Sankhya philosophy. But in this context, this Kapila is the impostor Kapila who proposes the atheistic philosophy of Sankhya, which I'll try to talk about a little bit. And after Sankhya, you have Nyaya. So the Nyaya philosophy, the Acharya is Gautam Rishi. And then for yoga, I just mentioned his name before, Patanjali is there. And then finally for Vedanta, we have Vedavyasa himself. And this particular purport in the Prayers of the Personified Vedas chapter in the 10th canto was explaining how each of the previous 5 philosophies, aside from Vedanta, they have some flaw within them. And it's actually Vedanta philosophy which actually provides us with complete knowledge of Krishna, flawless knowledge of Krishna. So for example, in Karma Mimamsa philosophy, there's no conception of a spiritual world. They say in Karma Mimamsa philosophy that the highest attainment for the soul is simply the heavenly planets. And they simply focus on the Karma Kanda section of the Vedas. And they think that God, or the controlling power within this universe, is simply karma. So once karma dictates one's past, what happened in one's past, it determines what's happening currently in the present, and it's going to determine what's going to happen in the future. So their focus is simply just to get good karma, do good activities, especially sacrifices, karma kind of sacrifices, and attain the highest destination, which is the heavenly planets. But we learn from Shastras like Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita itself, and from great eulogies by great devotees like Lord Brahma in Brahma Samhita. They're all explaining of a reality for the soul beyond this material world itself, which is the spiritual world. So this Vedavyas, he counteracts this philosophy by explaining that the heavenly planets is not the highest attainment. Even beyond the heavenly planets, beyond the crust of this universe, there exists the Brahma Jyoti, then there exists the Vaikuntha planets where there is life full of Satchitananda. So that's relatively an easier philosophy to sort of dismantle. Then comes Vaisheshika philosophy. So there's an axiom in Vaisheshika philosophy which explains that that which is the smallest is eternal. That which is the smallest is eternal. So Vaisheshika philosophy, those who adhere to this philosophy, they accept that the super soul and the soul exist. They accept this. But for them, that which is the smallest and therefore also eternal
is the atom. So this is the original atomic theory. So they give more preference to atoms and molecules, and they say that the atoms and the molecules is the cause of everything which is going on right now. The way that Vedavyas dismantles this philosophy is, like, one of the ways which he says is that if you say that atoms and molecules, they're the reason for everything happening right now, then you can't explain the creation of the universe, because at the beginning of creation, when the atoms and molecules came about and arranged themselves into different structures and stuff like that, there was no karmic impulse for them to do that. There was no karmic impulse or reason for them to come about and form themselves into different shapes and different bodies and different arrangements. Whereas it's actually the karmic baggage of the soul which has to be entered into the material world. That's the reason why the material world is created. You see, dead matter doesn't have any karma attached to it. It's just dead matter. But this whole material world exists because of the desires and the past karma, right, of the souls. And when the souls are injected by Vishnu into this material world, then a secondary effect of that is that the material world has to be generated so that the living souls can play out their past karma and their past desires, fulfill their past desires. So that's one way in which this philosophy is defeated. Then we come to Sankhya philosophy. Now Sankhya philosophy, we've discussed about Sankhya philosophy. It consists of the different elements like the Jnanindriyas, the Karmendriyas, the Panchamabhuta, the objects of the senses, the mind intelligence and false ego. This particular atheistic aspect of Sankhya, they attribute that the soul and the super soul is one. It's the same thing. Now, one of the underlying foundations of Sankhya, atheistic Sankhya, is that they attribute consciousness to the soul. Right? Consciousness and awareness is attributed to the soul, but activity and purpose and cause is attributed to the material elements. Does it make sense? So they say that, okay, the soul comes into the material world, right? Like you're in the body, we're in the body right now, and all we're doing is just observing. That's it. Right? But everything that's happening in our life, that's being impelled by the three modes of material nature and by Mother Nature herself. And you could say that, okay, that is, in one sense it's true, because Krishna does say in the Bhagavad Gita, right? He says, Prakrite kriyamana ene gune karmani sarvasha ankara ityame kartamiti manyate, right? He says that because he thinks that he's the doer because of the false ego, he doesn't realize it's actually the modes of material nature which are doing everything. But elsewhere in the Bhagavad Gita, it also says, right, when it talks about the different doers of action, one of the doers of the action is the Atma, the Jiva, the soul himself. So one way in which Vedavyas dismantles this philosophy of Sankhya, which attributes consciousness and awareness to the soul, but actual activity and cause and effect to dead matter, he says that, okay, fine, fair enough. We see in the Shastra that there's many quotations in the Shastra which explain that, okay, if you perform such and such sacrifice, right, then you'll go to the heavenly kingdom and you'll enjoy a life of 10,000 years there. Or if you perform devotional service, then you'll go back to the spiritual world. Now, if the soul was just a passive witness in all of this, then all these recommendations for Vedic sacrifice and elevation to the higher planetary systems wouldn't mean anything. It wouldn't mean anything, because the soul has to be the doer of action in order to enjoy the results of his actions. But if the soul is just there in matter, and the soul is just observing and not doing anything, he's not in control of what he's doing, nor is he enjoying the results of his actions, then all these quotations in the Shastras which recommend one to elevate oneself to the spiritual world, or even within this universe to higher planetary systems, they lose all their importance and they lose all their meaning. So Vedavyas says, therefore the soul is not just the conscious observer, but the soul is the doer of action and is the enjoyer of action as well. So this is how he dismantles Sankhya philosophy. Then we come to Nyaya. So Nyaya is like the atheistic Nyaya philosophy we see in Chaitanya Leela, how before Lord Chaitanya, young Nimai Pandit, right, before he became a quote-unquote Vaishnava. Of course, Lord Chaitanya is Krishna himself, is the crest jewel of all Vaishnavas, but before that he was acting as a impersonalistic sort of philosopher. And he was the master of Nyaya, and no one would want to challenge Lord Chaitanya. Right? So, Nyaya philosophy says that one can gain liberation by eliminating such things as misery, unhappiness, distress. It's more in the mind. So they attribute direct perception and inference. Right? So it's pratyaksha praman and anuman praman. They don't give any precedence to Shabda Brahman. How the Vaishnava philosophers in Vedanta, the importance is given to transcendental knowledge contained in the Shastras. Whereas in Nyaya, one only accepts knowledge through direct perception, and only accepts, if direct perception doesn't work, then they use Anuman Praman. Like that. So, they say that when the soul actually gets liberated, it loses its consciousness. So they don't, unlike the Sankhya philosophers, which attribute awareness and perception to the soul, the Sankhya philosophers, because they're more impersonal and more, I guess you could say, atheistic, they say that awareness is not a significant function of the soul. In fact, when the soul gets liberated, it is not aware anymore. It loses its consciousness. It may exist, but it's not conscious. This is what they say. So, obviously we can understand from elsewhere, from the Vedanta, from the Bhakti Shastras, that the soul is Satchit Ananda. It is always conscious. We see in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells in 2.12 to Arjuna, that all these kings here who have gathered, they always existed as individuals, they're currently existing, and they'll continue to exist as well. So that's Nyaya. And then we come to Yoga. Now, Yoga philosophy is getting a little closer, but they accept the existence of Paramatma, but they use the Paramatma as a guide or a stepping stone to achieve liberation. So they don't give full importance to Krishna, service to Krishna. They say that to help you in your pranayama, to help you in your pratyahara, to help you in your dhyana, you may use the concept of God as a helping hand to achieve samadhi, to achieve the perfection of yoga, which is samadhi, which is absorption in the self. If they're lucky, if they have some tinge of bhakti, then they'll make a distinction between the Paramatma and their own self. Otherwise, they'll consider themselves to be the Paramatma itself. So they accept the existence of a Paramatma, but they use the Paramatma as just a helping sort of stepping stone, just to help them progress in their own yogic path. So the focus and the emphasis is not given at all to serving God. So it's flawed there as well. But Vedanta, that's like the topmost knowledge. And even then, within Vedanta, we have different branches like Vishishta Advaita, Advaita, Advaita. I haven't looked into that too much. But the point I wanted to make there is the Vedic culture proposes all these different branches of knowledge. And it's not until one actually comes to purely studying Vedanta philosophy that one can begin to inculcate renunciation. There's a nice verse which I read yesterday in Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is Canto 10, Chapter 87, Text 39. So this is referring to members of the renounced order, and specifically the renounced order here refers to those who are practicing renunciation, practicing an impersonal philosophy. Impersonal philosophy. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Dehavadbir avapyate. He says in the 12th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, he says that for them, the impersonalistic path is very difficult. But those who adopt the path of personally worshipping the personal form of Krishna, then Krishna becomes a swift deliverer for them from the ocean of birth and death. So this verse is saying members of the renounced order, and we can take renounced order to be, in fact, in bhakti it can be anyone, because in fact anyone, regardless of your ashram, everyone in bhakti is renounced. We're renounced from sense enjoyment, we're renounced from the material conception of life. So members of the renounced order who fail to uproot the last traces of material desire in their hearts remain impure, and thus you, Krishna, do not allow them to understand you. So even if you're in the renounced order of life, if you don't uproot the last tinges of material desire for sense gratification, Krishna doesn't allow us to understand him. Although you are present within their hearts, for them you are like a jewel worn around the neck of a man who has totally forgotten that it is there. So it's a nice analogy. So Krishna is within our heart like a jewel locket, but we don't realize the value of the jewel that we're wearing. So Krishna is like Paramatma. Krishna is compared to the jewel locket of an ignorant person. In the purport it says, a mere show of renunciation is not sufficient to gain a person entrance into the kingdom of God. One must undergo a thorough change of heart, symptomized by a complete lack of interest in the self-destructive habits of sense gratification, both gross and subtle. Not only must the true sage refrain from even thinking about illicit sex, meat eating, intoxication, and gambling, but he must also give up his desires for reputation and position. Altogether, these demands add up to a formidable challenge, but the fruits of true renunciation in Krishna consciousness are well worth a lifetime of endeavor. So this is a good definition for the renunciation that occurs when one practices Vedanta, when one practices the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. One renounces on the physical platform from the 4 destructive habits of illicit sex, meat eating, intoxication, gambling, and then one also gives up subtle sense desire, subtle sense gratification, which is name, fame, all that sort of stuff. So there's subtle sense desire or sex desire, and there's more gross sex desire as well. So this is, if one is able to give up these two, the subtle and the gross, this is the true meaning of renunciation, or the true result of renunciation that results by practicing Krishna consciousness. So I'll just talk quickly about the final third thing. So we've talked about knowledge and we've talked about renunciation. The Shastras explain that there's one more thing that comes after renunciation, and that is the complete elimination of karma. We've seen in Brahma Samhita, Yas Tvendra Gopam Atavendra Mahossav Karma Bandhanurupam Falabhajanam Atanoti. The Karma Mimamsa philosophers, they only listen to the first 2 lines. That everyone from Indra to the Indra Gopa is affected by the results of their fruitive activities. That's it. But they don't listen to the 3rd line, Karmani Nirdahati Kintuja Bhakti Bhajam. They don't realize that by practicing devotional service, by following Vedanta, Krishna can interfere with one's karma, which is so strong and powerful and binding that he can get rid of this karma. Now, the Gopal Tapani Upanishad explains, gives a nice definition to devotional service. Devotional service is defined as that process, positively, number 1, by which one attaches one's mind to Krishna. One attaches one's mind to Krishna. Second point there in the definition of devotional service, after one attaching one's mind to Krishna, is one gives up all material designations and desires. And then there's a duration criteria. For how long does one do that? In this lifetime and in future lifetimes. And then it gives the result. What is the result of that? The result of doing this by fixing one's mind on Krishna is that one's karma, one's material bondage is completely destroyed. And I'll just quickly give a couple of examples of why Krishna still allows his devotees to suffer quote-unquote karma. It's actually not karma. When Krishna takes away the material karma of a devotee, we see in the material world that devotees are still suffering. And this is a question that Parikshit Maharaj asks Shukadev Goswami in the chapter of Vrikasura. He says, we see that Lord Shiva, he's a renunciant, he's practically living like a homeless person, literally. He lives in the smashan, right? And we see that his devotees are like all rich and opulent. right? All these Rakshasas like Ravana, etc. And then we see that Krishna, he's like living in Vaikuntha, or Vishnu is living very opulently in Vaikuntha, but then all of his devotees, like Kolavichar Sridhar and Sudama, right, and 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan, they're just living as like poor beggars and renunciates. So how do we understand this? And why are Krishna's devotees, why are Vishnu's devotees undergoing trials and tribulations? I thought you were taking away all their karma, Krishna. Why are they still suffering from, setbacks in the material world? So one thing which is given is that this setbacks and distresses that affect the devotee, actually the devotee takes it as ecstasy. That's one point. So ecstasy, and the example is given that if one is suffering from a boil on their hand or wherever, somewhere from their body, then if a physician comes along with some ointment and he rubs the ointment on the boil, then initially it's like a stinging sensation. But the person who's suffering from the boil, he'll accept that stinging sensation as great ecstasy and great delight, because he or she knows that they're going to be very soon cured from the pain that they're feeling. So the devotee who undergoes suffering, like take Queen Kunti for example, she takes this suffering to be complete ecstasy. So she wants this suffering to come again and again, more and more. So that's one point. The second point is that the karma that one gets by one's own sense gratification versus the distresses that one gets by the complete arrangement of Krishna, it's different. The karma, or the result that one gets because of one's own sinful activity, results in a residue, a very subtle residue, and that is known as kutam. And kutam is that really subtle residue or vasana which pushes the soul to commit that sinful activity again. And that's very dangerous, because that implicates the soul in the cycle of birth and death for a long period of time. Whereas for a devotee, when a devotee suffers the so-called results of karma in the form of distresses, but actually they're arranged by Krishna, there's no residue of kutam at all. Krishna puts the devotee in a distressful situation, and once the devotee passes that exam or passes that test, there's no further vasana or desire within the devotee's mind to experience anymore. Krishna just puts the devotee in distress and that's it. The devotee learns the lesson, that's it. Whereas karma is not like that. Karma, you have to keep going again and again, birth after birth. So that's the second point. The third point is that by placing devotees in misery, right? When Krishna puts his devotees into distress and misery, that safeguards the path of bhakti by intrusion by people who are faithless. Otherwise people will say, these devotees, they're enjoying, they're living a really nice lifetime, really nice life, free from all miseries. So let me go and see what they're doing. So they'll approach Krishna in a faithless way. So to safeguard that and to make it seem that the path of bhakti is just like, the hedonistic lifestyle of what people are living, Krishna puts his devotees into misery. So that only those who want to approach Krishna purely for rendering service to him, only they can approach bhakti. Whereas others will look from the outside and they'll think, what's the point in practicing bhakti anyway? Even those who are devotees of Krishna, even they're suffering. So why should I practice bhakti? So bhakti will be safeguarded from faithless people. And the last point, which Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur puts forward, is that by placing devotees in misery, Krishna increases multifold times their appreciation of Krishna. So he gives a nice quote. He says that warm water is most appreciated in winter time. Or, the smell of a flower is appreciated where in an area where the smell is not so good. The sunshine is appreciated when the weather is rainy. So he gives like a lot of different examples like that. So then finally he says, and similarly, love for me and attraction for me is much more appreciated by devotees when they're put through miseries and distresses. So that's why Krishna puts his devotees through apparently distressful situations. So just to summarize quickly, so there's three things we looked at today. We looked at transcendental knowledge and its effect, which is virakti, which is renunciation from this material world. And then finally, we summarized by looking at a third aspect, which comes in that line, which is complete elimination of karma. And we discussed the reasons as to why Krishna puts his devotees through distresses. So we'll finish here. Thank you very much. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.